They were accustomed to measuring power by what could be counted, by the width of armored formations stretching across maps, by the number of tanks rolling in parallel columns, by the sheer mass of men that could be mobilized, transported, and sacrificed if necessary. Soviet doctrine was built on the assumption that supremacy emerged from accumulation. If enough steel moved forward, if enough aircraft filled the sky, if enough bodies absorbed losses, resistance would eventually collapse. Power in this worldview was tangible, visible, and above all numerical. Victory was something achieved by pressure rather than precision. This logic shaped everything. Planning rooms were filled with calculations of density and depth. Training emphasized coordination of large units over individual initiative. Technology mattered, but only insofar as it could be produced in volume. No single machine was expected to change outcomes on its own. Nothing was supposed to exist outside the arithmetic of mass. And for years, that belief appeared justified. Then came a moment that did not fit the equation. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It did not arrive with fanfare or declaration. It appeared quietly, buried in performance data, flight reports, and technical assessments that made officers pause before speaking. A single American fighter began to surface in analyses, not because of how many there were, but because of what it could do. And with that appearance came a realization that was deeply uncomfortable. Technology, when pushed far enough, could humiliate an entire military philosophy without firing a single shot. The **vought F4U-4 Corsai did not present itself as a conventional threat. To Soviet analysts, it appeared less like an enemy aircraft and more like a contradiction. A piston-driven fighter that climbed faster than expected interception envelopes allowed. A machine that entered dives with a stability that contradicted structural assumptions. An aircraft that delivered sustained power where engineers insisted limits should exist. In briefing rooms, no one spoke about dogfights. No one discussed turning contests or pilot skill. The language shifted almost immediately. Discussions revolved around broken envelopes, invalidated models, and margins that no longer existed. When Soviet pilots examined the Corsairs' performance figures, the shock was not emotional, it was technical. Over 2,000 horsepower delivered reliably, not as a theoretical maximum, but as an operational reality. Aggressive climb performance above 20,000 feet, maintained without the fragility that plagued lighter designs. Controlled dives through speed ranges that Soviet aircraft manuals treated as danger zones. The conclusion was unavoidable. This aircraft forgave mistakes. It absorbed stress. It allowed its pilot to push harder, recover faster, and survive errors that would be fatal in other machines. That single characteristic was devastating. Soviet aviation culture still demanded absolute precision. An error meant loss of control, structural failure, or fire. Pilots were trained to respect narrow margins because their aircraft offered little tolerance beyond them. The Corsair represented the opposite philosophy. It carried armor. It used self-sealing fuel tanks. Its structure could absorb damage and remain controllable. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns delivered overwhelming firepower in seconds, compressing engagements into brief, decisive moments. Where Soviet pilots were forced to calculate every move, American pilots could advance aggressively, knowing the machine would support them. This difference reshaped the psychology of combat. One side flew knowing that survival depended on perfection. The other flew knowing that the aircraft itself expanded the boundaries of survival. Confidence followed naturally. and confidence multiplied by speed, altitude, and firepower became dominance. There was also the sound. During high-speed dives, air passing through the oil cooler intakes at the wing roots produced a sharp, unmistakable whistle. It was not merely aerodynamic noise. It became a signature. Reports later noted involuntary reactions when similar sounds were replayed during technical evaluations. The aircraft announced itself before impact, not as intimidation, but as inevitability. By the time the sound was recognized, response options were already gone. Over time, it became clear that the fear associated with the Corsair did not stem from direct combat alone. It arose from a broader strategic realization. If the United States could design and produce an aircraft like this in meaningful numbers, the problem was not the Corsair itself. The problem was the system behind it. An industrial structure capable of building engines powerful enough to carry armor without sacrificing performance. A manufacturing base able to produce complex airframes consistently. A logistical network that supported machines designed without compromise. Weight, which Soviet engineers still treated as a liability, had been transformed into an advantage. Protection no longer meant vulnerability. Complexity no longer implied unreliability. The traditional trade-offs that defined earlier fighter design had been erased by surplus power and industrial precision. Internal Soviet documents avoided words like superiority. They preferred safer terms, different philosophy, alternative priorities, contrasting design approaches. But among pilots, the understanding was unmistakable. The Corsair represented a form of warfare in which the individual ceased to be a heroic centerpiece and became an operator of overwhelming machinery. Victory was no longer courage against courage. It was engineering against hope. And that was the true humiliation. Not defeat in battle, but displacement in principle. The realization that mass alone could no longer guarantee dominance. That no quantity of formations, tanks, or men could compensate for a machine that invalidated doctrine simply by existing. The F4U-4 Corsair did not need to fight the Soviet Union to deliver this lesson. Its existence was enough. It stood as proof that in the modern sky, sovereignty belongs to those who build better, not those who merely build more. What made this realization so corrosive was not merely that a single aircraft outperformed expectations, but that it exposed a flaw embedded deep within Soviet strategic thinking. The doctrine of mass was not just a method. It was an identity. It shaped how officers were promoted, how factories were organized, how victory itself was imagined. Power was something that could be summoned through scale, imposed through repetition, enforced by endurance. If one unit failed, another would replace it. If losses mounted, numbers would compensate. This logic had endured revolutions, purges, and wars. It was treated as immutable truth. The Corsair challenged that truth without confrontation. It did not demand a response because it offered none. There was no way to surround it, no numerical solution to apply. It could not be worn down by attrition because it refused prolonged engagement. It climbed beyond reach, struck decisively, and departed before mass could be brought to bear. In doing so, it revealed the central weakness of volume-based power. It requires time. And time was precisely what the Corsair denied. This forced an uncomfortable shift in perspective. Soviet planners were accustomed to asking how many aircraft would be needed to counter a threat. With the Corsair, the question became whether a counter was even possible within existing constraints. Speed compressed decision cycles. Altitude erased interception windows. Survivability nullified the effectiveness of brief successes. Every traditional lever of control lost relevance. The United States, by contrast, had built its air power on a different foundation. American war planning did not rely on exhausting the enemy through sheer persistence. It sought to overwhelm systems rather than units. This difference was subtle but decisive. Where mass doctrine assumed that endurance would eventually prevail, American engineering assumed that dominance could be established so completely that endurance would never be tested. This philosophy was visible long before the Corsair took to the air. It was present in the way American factories were designed for throughput rather than austerity, in the way tolerances were tightened instead of simplified, in the way training pipelines emphasized repetition under realistic conditions rather than idealized scenarios. The goal was not to create perfect pilots flying delicate machines. It was to create competent pilots flying machines that forgave imperfection. The Corsair was a natural expression of this mindset. Its power was not optimized for minimal fuel consumption or ease of maintenance alone. It was optimized for margin. Excess power allowed excess weight. Excess weight enabled armor. Armor enabled survival. Survival enabled aggression. Aggression, when repeated systematically, became dominance. Each link in that chain reinforced the next, forming a closed loop that Soviet aircraft philosophy could not replicate without dismantling its own assumptions. Attempts to analyze the Corsair within existing frameworks produced contradictions. Engineers noted that adding similar levels of armor and protection to Soviet designs resulted in unacceptable performance losses. Increasing engine output to compensate introduced reliability issues and maintenance burdens that strained logistics. Simplifying designs preserved output but sacrificed survivability. Every path led back to the same conclusion. The American solution was not a single innovation, but a convergence of industrial capacity, materials science, and production discipline that could not be quickly imitated. This realization extended beyond aviation. If the United States could field such an aircraft repeatedly, reliably, and in numbers sufficient to sustain operations, then air superiority was not a phase of conflict. It was a condition. And conditions do not negotiate. They persist. Among pilots, the effects were immediate and personal. Training had taught them to respect envelopes, to manage energy carefully, to avoid pushing aircraft beyond narrow safety margins. Facing a machine that treated those margins as suggestions rather than limits was destabilizing. Engagements became asymmetrical not just in outcome, but in experience. One pilot fought against physics and stress simultaneously. The other fought with them as allies. Over time, this asymmetry reshaped behavior. Avoidance became rational. Hesitation replaced confidence. Reputation spread faster than reports. Even without direct confrontation, the presence of such an aircraft altered decisions before takeoff, during mission planning, and in moments of contact. Fear did not need repeated reinforcement. Once learned, it sustained itself. The Corsair's greatest impact, therefore, was not measured in victories alone. It was measured in choices never made, engagements never attempted, doctrines quietly adjusted to avoid confrontation with a reality that could not be reversed. It demonstrated that humiliation in modern warfare does not require defeat. It requires recognition. Recognition that the enemy no longer needs to outnumber you. Recognition that courage cannot overcome structural disadvantage. Recognition that the sky, once contested, has chosen a side based on engineering rather than ideology. And as this understanding settled in, It became clear that the Corsair was not an endpoint, but a signal. A preview of a future in which industrial systems, not heroic narratives, would decide conflicts. A future where those who built better machines would dictate the terms of engagement. Before the first aircraft ever appeared on the horizon, what truly shattered any remaining confidence was not superiority in one isolated metric, but the way performance erased the very possibility of response. Interception, as the Soviet planners understood it, depended on time. Time to detect, time to climb, time to position, time to engage. The logic assumed that even if an enemy aircraft was faster or stronger, there would always be a window, however narrow, where skill, coordination, or numerical pressure could be applied. The **Vought F4U-4 Corsair** destroyed that assumption at its foundation. Speed did not simply make the Corsair harder to catch. It compressed the entire sequence of decision-making until reaction itself became meaningless. By the time a contact was identified and classified, the aircraft had already crossed the engagement zone. Attempts to position interceptors were rendered academic. The geometry no longer worked. Traditional interception arcs assumed relative parity in climb and acceleration. The Corsair's power broke those equations. It arrived already holding the advantage, already dictating altitude, already controlling energy. Climb performance deepened the humiliation. Soviet interception doctrine relied on layered responses, climbing through predictable altitude bands to meet incoming threats. The Corsair did not respect those layers. It passed through them. Sustained climb rates carried it above the operational comfort zone of opposing aircraft. Where engines lost efficiency, control surfaces grew sluggish, and pilots felt the strain of pushing machines beyond intended envelopes. Interceptors did not fail dramatically. They simply fell behind, watching the distance widen in a way that no training could correct. Dive capability completed the trap. Once engaged, the Corsair could disengage at will. Diving away at speeds that destabilized pursuing aircraft, it transformed pursuit into self-destruction. Control limits that Soviet pilots were trained never to exceed became irrelevant to the Corsair, whose structure and stability allowed it to pass through those regimes intact. The result was a one-sided dynamic. One aircraft could enter or exit combat whenever it chose, while the other had no equivalent option. This asymmetry produced a distinct psychological effect. Pilots were not being outflown. They were being outrun by time itself. Every engagement felt delayed, every response obsolete before it was executed. There was no moment of parity, no fleeting balance to exploit. Even correct decisions arrived too late. In air combat, where seconds defined survival, this delay translated directly into helplessness. Attempts to adapt doctrine only reinforced the problem. Increasing readiness reduced fatigue tolerance. Pushing engines harder accelerated failures. Adjusting interception altitudes narrowed margins further. Each solution demanded greater precision from machines and pilots already operating at their limits. Meanwhile, the Corsair functioned comfortably within its own envelope, its excess power and stability absorbing stress without complaint. The imbalance widened with every attempted correction. What made this particularly corrosive was its inevitability. There was no dramatic failure to analyze, no catastrophic loss to explain away. The system simply did not work against this aircraft. Interception was not difficult. It was structurally impossible under existing constraints. That realization spread quietly but decisively. Confidence did not collapse in panic. it eroded through repeated confirmation that nothing could be done in time. In this way, performance itself became a form of domination, not loud, not theatrical, but absolute. The Corsair did not defeat interception by confronting it head-on. It rendered the concept obsolete by denying the temporal space interception required to exist. And in doing so, it forced a painful recognition. When an enemy controls speed, altitude, and disengagement simultaneously, defense becomes a theory rather than a practice. Altitude had always been treated as an advantage. With the arrival of the Vought F4U-4 Corsair it became something far more final. It ceased to be a tactical choice and transformed into absolute authority. In traditional air combat thinking, altitude offered options: better visibility, improved energy states, a chance to initiate or disengage. But those options assumed that both sides could reach roughly the same vertical space. The Corsair shattered that assumption by turning altitude into a one-sided domain. For Soviet pilots, climbing was no longer a maneuver, it was a gamble. Engines strained as altitude increased, performance degraded, and control margins narrowed. Every additional 1,000 feet came with penalties that accumulated rapidly. Oxygen systems, cooling efficiency, and responsiveness all began to work against the pilot. The aircraft felt heavier, slower to answer inputs, increasingly reluctant to obey. Yet the Corsair did not share this struggle. It operated higher with confidence, retaining responsiveness and power where opposing machines became hesitant and fragile. This disparity created a new hierarchy in the sky. The aircraft above dictated everything. It chose when to engage, from which direction, and with what level of aggression. The aircraft below reacted, always late, always constrained. Even before contact, the imbalance was felt. Seeing an opponent climbing beyond reach produced a distinct sense of exclusion, as though the fight itself had moved to a place where participation was no longer permitted. Altitude removed choice. When the Corsair held the vertical advantage, there was no forcing function left to the opposing pilot. He could not compel a turning engagement. He could not threaten from below without exposing himself. He could not wait patiently, because the attack would come on terms he could not influence. The fight no longer unfolded between equals maneuvering for advantage. It became a sequence imposed from above. This had profound psychological consequences. Pilots are trained to believe that skill can compensate for disadvantage. That belief relies on the idea that the aircraft will at least respond. When altitude became unattainable, that faith eroded. Training lost relevance when the machine itself could not access the same battle space. Experience offered no solution to a problem defined by physics rather than technique. Repeated exposure to this reality reshaped expectations. Pilots learned to associate altitude with inevitability. When the Corsair appeared above, outcomes were anticipated before they occurred. The knowledge that an opponent could dive with impunity, convert altitude into speed, strike, and climb away beyond reach produced a sense of being trapped in a lower tier of the sky. It was not fear in the dramatic sense. It was resignation informed by pattern recognition. Attempts to contest altitude only reinforced the imbalance. Pushing aircraft higher accelerated wear, increased failure rates, and exhausted pilots faster. Temporary gains came at unsustainable cost. Meanwhile, the Corsair maintained its advantage without visible strain, turning what should have been an extreme regime into routine operating space. What was exceptional for one side was normal for the other. In this environment, altitude ceased to be a variable and became a verdict. Control of the vertical dimension meant control of tempo, geometry, and survival. The pilot above was never hurried. The pilot below was always reacting. Over time, this vertical separation translated into psychological separation. One side fought with options. The other fought with limitations. This was the deeper humiliation. Not that the Corsair could fly higher, but that it made the sky itself uneven. It transformed a shared arena into stratified space where access determined relevance. In doing so, it demonstrated that air superiority was no longer about contesting the same air. It was about occupying air the opponent could not reach and dictating terms from there. What ultimately tipped the balance was not just how fast or how high one aircraft could fly, but how it behaved when things went wrong. In air combat, mistakes are inevitable. Fatigue, stress, damaged components, momentary disorientation, all are part of the environment. The decisive difference lay in how aircraft responded to those moments. One philosophy treated errors as unforgivable, the other absorbed them and kept flying. This contrast between forgiveness and fragility reshaped every engagement before it even began. Soviet aircraft were designed around narrow margins. Performance was achieved through lightness, tight tolerances, and structures optimized for ideal conditions. Within those limits, they could perform impressively. Outside them, consequences were immediate and often fatal. A misjudged dive angle, a brief overspeed, a hit in the wrong place, and the aircraft ceased to be controllable. Pilots were trained accordingly. Precision was not encouraged, it was demanded. Survival depended on avoiding error rather than managing it. The Corsair represented the opposite assumption. Its designers accepted that pilots would be pushed beyond comfort, that combat would introduce chaos, that damage would occur. Instead of attempting to eliminate those realities, the aircraft was built to endure them. Armor protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the likelihood of fire. Structural strength allowed the airframe to remain intact through stresses that would tear lighter designs apart. Control surfaces remained responsive where others became unpredictable. The aircraft did not reward recklessness, but it tolerated imperfection. This tolerance changed everything. A pilot flying a forgiving machine behaves differently. He presses an attack longer. He accepts angles and speeds that would otherwise be avoided. He recovers from errors rather than paying for them with his life. Over time, this freedom accumulates into dominance. Aggression becomes sustainable because survival is not contingent on flawless execution. The machine shares the burden of combat rather than placing it entirely on the human. By contrast, fragility enforces caution. Pilots constrained by narrow margins learn to disengage early, to avoid aggressive maneuvers, to fly defensively even when opportunities appear. Every decision carries the weight of irreversible consequence. In such an environment, hesitation becomes rational. Over time, that hesitation erodes initiative and confidence. The fight is lost not through cowardice, but through arithmetic. The cost of error is simply too high. This asymmetry produced a subtle but devastating psychological effect. One side entered combat knowing that mistakes could be corrected. The other entered knowing that mistakes would be punished instantly. That knowledge followed pilots into every maneuver, every climb, every dive. It shaped how close they were willing to press, how long they stayed engaged, how aggressively they pursued advantage. Confidence, once lost, did not return easily. Damage reports reinforced the lesson. Aircraft returned with holes, bent panels, scarred surfaces, still flyable, still lethal. Encounters that should have ended in losses instead ended in repairs and debriefings. Survivability was not theoretical. It was observed repeatedly. Each return to base was a demonstration that the machine could take punishment and continue functioning. Each survival reinforced the belief that the aircraft could be trusted. On the other side, losses were often absolute. Aircraft did not limp home. They vanished from formations. The line between damage and destruction was thin, and pilots knew it. Watching opponents absorb fire that would have been fatal in their own aircraft deepened the sense of imbalance. It was not simply that one side had better machines. It was that one side was allowed to learn from mistakes while the other was not. This disparity extended beyond individual encounters. Training pipelines, replacement rates, and experience levels diverged rapidly when survivability differed. Pilots who lived flew again. They accumulated knowledge, refined tactics, and shared lessons. Pilots who did not survive took their experience with them. Over time, forgiving machines produced veteran crews. Fragile machines produced constant turnover. In this context, forgiveness became a strategic weapon. It multiplied experience, sustained morale, and enabled consistent aggression. Fragility did the opposite. It enforced conservatism, accelerated losses, and eroded confidence even among the most skilled. The outcome was not dramatic, but it was decisive. The Corsair did not need to be perfect. It needed to endure. And in enduring, it allowed its pilots to push harder, stay longer, and return again. In industrial warfare, that margin is everything. It turns air combat from a test of flawless execution into a test of systems, and systems that forgive inevitably outlast those that do not. Firepower changed the meaning of air combat long before it changed the statistics. What mattered was not simply how much metal could be thrown forward, but how quickly a mistake could be converted into an irreversible outcome. In this respect, the **Vought F4U-4 Corsair represented a final judgment rather than a competitive exchange. 6 heavy machine guns, synchronized and concentrated, did not invite prolonged engagement. They compressed combat into moments where reaction time, not courage, determined survival. For pilots accustomed to drawn-out maneuvering contests, this compression was psychologically destabilizing. There was no gradual escalation, no series of probing moves through which advantage might be tested and adjusted. Engagements began already near their conclusion. A brief alignment, a short burst, and the encounter was decided. The margin between opportunity and destruction narrowed to seconds, often less. In that environment, even correct decisions arrived too late to matter. This reality reshaped perception before it reshaped tactics. Knowing that an opponent's firepower could end a fight almost instantly altered how pilots assessed risk. Exposure, even momentary, carried disproportionate danger. The awareness that a single mistake would not merely damage an aircraft, but erase it, created a constant undercurrent of tension. The cockpit ceased to be a place of calculated maneuvering and became a space governed by anticipation of sudden finality. The Corsair's firepower was not merely heavy. It was decisive. Concentration mattered as much as volume. When rounds arrived together, at high velocity, into a tightly focused window, survivability dropped sharply. There was no gradual degradation, no chance to absorb punishment and disengage. Outcomes were binary. Either the attack missed or it ended the engagement outright. This binary nature amplified fear far beyond what numerical comparisons suggested. Over time, this produced a chilling effect. Pilots began to fly as though every exposure could be their last. Aggression required absolute confidence, yet confidence was precisely what repeated encounters eroded. The presence of such firepower turned airspace into a field of invisible lines that could not be crossed safely. The fight was no longer about outmaneuvering an opponent into disadvantage. It was about avoiding alignment long enough to escape. This had cascading consequences. Formations loosened as pilots sought space. Engagements shortened as risk outweighed potential gain. Initiative shifted to those who could strike first from positions that minimized response. The aircraft, capable of delivering decisive firepower on its own terms, dictated the rhythm of the sky. Others adapted by minimizing contact, not because they lacked skill, but because the cost of error had become absolute. Psychologically, this was exhausting. Living with the knowledge that a single lapse could end everything imposed a constant cognitive load. Pilots flew defensively even when doctrine encouraged aggression. The calculation was unavoidable. No maneuver, no burst of brilliance could compensate for being caught in the Corsair's firing window. The aircraft's guns did not merely threaten destruction. They promised it. In this way, firepower became more than a physical attribute. It became a mental boundary. The Corsair did not need to score a hit in every encounter to dominate behavior. The certainty of what would happen if it did was enough. Combat ceased to be a dialogue between pilots and became a unilateral declaration enforced by velocity and mass. This was the deeper transformation. Air combat, once imagined as a contest of decisions unfolding over time, was reduced to a narrow slice where judgment replaced exchange. The Corsair's firepower ensured that when the moment came, there would be no ambiguity about the result. And that certainty, repeated and internalized, reshaped the sky into a place where hesitation was survival and engagement was submission. Long before visual contact, before instruments confirmed range or bearing, there was the sound. Not loud in a theatrical sense, not chaotic, but sharp, distinct, and unmistakable. During high-speed dives, air rushing through the oil cooler intakes at the roots of the wings produced a piercing whistle that cut through cockpit noise and training instincts alike. It was not merely an aerodynamic byproduct, it became a signal. For those who encountered it repeatedly, the sound arrived as an announcement that the sequence of events had already begun and could no longer be altered. The psychological power of this sound lay in its timing. It did not coincide with impact, it preceded it. That interval, brief but undeniable, created anticipation without agency. By the time the whistle was recognized, options had already collapsed. The aircraft producing it was already committed to the attack path, converting altitude into speed, compressing distance into inevitability. Reaction did not disappear. It simply arrived too late to matter. Over time, this sequence conditioned responses in ways no briefing could undo. Reports described involuntary reactions when similar frequencies were encountered in unrelated contexts. Heads turned instinctively, muscles tightened, attention narrowed. The body responded before the mind finished interpreting. This was not fear born of imagination. It was fear learned through pattern. The brain associated the sound with outcomes that followed too quickly to resist. Conditioning replaced analysis. Recognition replaced calculation. This effect extended beyond individual encounters. Even pilots who had not faced the aircraft directly absorbed the reputation through shared experience. Stories circulated. Descriptions repeated. The sound became symbolic, standing in for the entire engagement. It no longer needed to be heard in combat to influence behavior. The expectation alone altered decisions. When planning routes, when choosing altitudes, When considering pursuit, the possibility of hearing that whistle shaped caution before the sky was ever entered. What made this especially corrosive was that the sound carried no threat of escalation, only conclusion. It did not suggest a prolonged fight or an exchange of maneuvers. It suggested that the moment for negotiation had passed. In this way, sound functioned as a psychological shortcut, bypassing doctrine and training to trigger survival instincts directly. The aircraft announced its presence not to intimidate, but to confirm that it had already achieved positional dominance. Over time, this auditory signature transformed into a form of psychological territory control. Areas of airspace were avoided not because they were constantly patrolled, but because they were associated with a particular sensory memory. Pilots learned to associate certain profiles, steep angles, sudden speed increases, shadows above with the expectation of that sound. Even when it did not occur, the anticipation alone shaped behavior. Fear did not need reinforcement. It sustained itself. This phenomenon revealed a deeper truth about air combat in the industrial age. Dominance is not exerted solely through visible force. It is exerted through predictability of outcome. When an aircraft's presence is reliably associated with irreversible consequences, its psychological footprint extends far beyond its physical reach. The sound became proof that control had already been lost. In this context, the aircraft did not need to be seen to be felt. It occupied the minds of those who flew beneath it, shaping choices before engagement and reactions during it. The whistle was not an accident of design. It became an unintended instrument of conditioning, turning sound into memory and memory into restraint. Thus, the battle was often decided before it began. By the time visual contact occurred, the mental outcome was already set. The sound had taught its lesson too well. In modern air combat, anticipation can be as decisive as firepower. And in this case, a simple byproduct of speed and design became a weapon that reached pilots before the aircraft ever did. Long before aircraft met in the air, the outcome of many encounters was already decided elsewhere. Reputation moved faster than formations, spread wider than patrols, and endured longer than any single engagement. Pilots learned not only from what they experienced, but from what they heard, what they were told, and what they watched happen to others. In this way, combat gradually ceased to be the primary teacher. Expectation took its place. The presence of an aircraft that consistently imposed decisive outcomes altered behavior even in its absence. Routes were adjusted, altitudes reconsidered. Aggressive plans quietly softened into cautious alternatives. This was not cowardice. It was rational adaptation. When repeated patterns demonstrate that engagement leads predictably to loss, avoidance becomes the most logical tactic. Over time, this logic embedded itself so deeply that contact no longer needed to occur to shape decisions. Reputation achieved what firepower alone could not. It removed the need for confrontation. Pilots began to treat certain silhouettes, sounds, and flight profiles as warnings rather than invitations. Recognition triggered withdrawal not because of panic, but because of calculation. The cost-benefit analysis no longer favored engagement. Even opportunities that appeared promising were weighed against remembered outcomes and quietly dismissed. This effect compounded with each retold encounter. Stories traveled faster than reports and carried more weight than statistics. Accounts of brief engagements ending abruptly, of aircraft disappearing in seconds, of survivability disparities too large to ignore, accumulated into a shared understanding. The narrative did not exaggerate, it condensed. It reduced complex dynamics into simple truths that guided behavior. Do not pursue, do not climb, do not linger. Once reputation reached this stage, direct combat became almost unnecessary. The aircraft exerted influence simply by existing within the same theater. Its psychological presence extended beyond its operational footprint. Pilots altered conduct not because they were currently threatened, but because they knew what would happen if they were. This preemptive compliance was the ultimate expression of dominance. Commanders noticed the shift indirectly. Missions returned without engagement. Opportunities passed without exploitation. Interceptions aborted early. Reports grew vague, citing unfavorable conditions or incomplete contact. These were not failures of discipline. They were acknowledgments of reality filtered through caution. Doctrine struggled to address a problem that did not manifest as defeat, but as reluctance. In this environment, fear did not announce itself loudly. It appeared as hesitation, as delay, as a subtle preference for survival over confrontation. It did not require constant reinforcement. Once learned, it sustained itself through memory and observation. Pilots did not need to see the aircraft every time they flew. They only needed to remember what it represented. This was psychological victory in its purest form. Not domination through repeated destruction, but control through anticipation. The enemy's decisions were shaped before engagement, their options narrowed before contact, their aggression tempered before commitment. Combat was avoided not because it was impossible, but because its outcome was already understood. Reputation, once established, became self-perpetuating. Each avoided engagement reinforced the belief that avoidance was correct. Each unchallenged presence strengthened the association between appearance and inevitability. Over time, the aircraft no longer needed to prove itself. Its history spoke for it. In this way, the sky was controlled without constant battle. Influence replaced force. Expectation replaced exchange. And the most telling measure of dominance was not how often the aircraft fought, but how often others chose not to. What finally unraveled was not equipment, but belief. Doctrine depends on assumptions, and assumptions endure only as long as reality tolerates them. Maneuver-based air combat doctrine assumed that skill could always be brought to bear, that positioning could be earned through training, that a sufficiently capable pilot could offset disadvantages through timing and judgment. The repeated presence of the **Vought F4U-4 Corsai made those assumptions increasingly difficult to defend. Traditional tactics relied on forcing the opponent into a shared envelope where maneuvering skill mattered. Turning fights, energy management within known limits, incremental gains exploited over time, these were the tools doctrine offered. But when an aircraft refused to enter that envelope, doctrine lost its leverage. The Corsair did not engage where maneuver theory applied. It imposed engagements where physics, not technique, determined outcomes. Skill could not compensate for an absence of speed, altitude, or survivability. The battlefield itself had shifted. Attempts to adapt doctrine revealed its fragility. Pilots were instructed to avoid certain regimes, to maintain tighter formations, to coordinate more precisely. Each adjustment demanded greater perfection from machines and men already operating at their limits. Errors multiplied under pressure. Fatigue increased. Margins shrank. The adaptations addressed symptoms rather than causes, and each failure reinforced the sense that the framework itself was no longer valid. This erosion was quiet. There was no formal declaration that doctrine had failed. Instead, it manifested in small deviations. Tactics were softened. Engagement criteria tightened. Initiative was deferred. Pilots were encouraged to preserve assets rather than press advantage. These changes were pragmatic, but they carried an implicit admission. The old rules no longer produced favorable outcomes. The most corrosive realization was that individual excellence could not bridge the gap. Veteran pilots with years of experience found themselves constrained by machines that could not operate in the same space as their opponent. Training that once conferred confidence now highlighted limitations. Mastery of maneuver became irrelevant when the aircraft itself could not survive long enough to apply it. This disconnect between effort and outcome undermined morale more effectively than defeat ever could. Doctrine depends on predictability. It offers a sense of control by mapping cause to effect. When those mappings break down, confidence follows. Pilots began to question not their own abilities, but the usefulness of the tactics they had been taught to trust. The sky no longer behaved according to the patterns they had internalized. Each encounter reinforced the same lesson. Adherence to doctrine did not improve survival odds. Improvised solutions emerged, but none addressed the core imbalance. Increasing aggression exposed fragility. Increasing caution seeded initiative. Neither path restored parity. The doctrine had been built for a world where opponents shared similar constraints. That world no longer existed. The Corsair did not violate doctrine by exploiting a loophole. It invalidated it by existing outside its scope. As confidence in doctrine waned, so did its authority. Pilots relied more on instinct and avoidance than on prescribed maneuvers. Commanders issued guidance that emphasized discretion over engagement. What had once been a coherent system of thought fractured into situational responses. Doctrine ceased to guide behavior and instead lagged behind it, recording changes after they occurred rather than directing them. This was collapse without spectacle. No dramatic defeat marked the end. Instead, there was a gradual acceptance that the theoretical foundation of air combat had shifted. The principles that once promised advantage now offered only exposure. In their place emerged a new, unspoken rule. Survival depended less on how well one flew and more on what one flew. In that realization, doctrine surrendered its claim to relevance. It could not command physics, alter industrial disparities, or manufacture margin where none existed. The Corsair had not merely defeated opposing tactics. It had rendered them obsolete. And once doctrine loses its explanatory power, its influence fades quickly. What remained was a cautious pragmatism shaped by recognition rather than belief. What changed most profoundly was not tactics or technology alone, but identity. For generations, air combat had been framed as a test of individual will and mastery. Pilots were celebrated as singular figures whose courage, instinct, and skill determined outcomes in the sky. This narrative depended on the belief that machines were secondary tools that amplified the pilot's intent but never replaced it. The arrival and sustained dominance of the Vought F4U-4 Corsair quietly dismantled that belief. The Corsair did not reward heroics. It rewarded discipline, coordination, and exploitation of systemic advantage. Success no longer hinged on improvisation in the moment, but on operating the aircraft as intended within a broader framework of dominance. Pilots who thrived were not those who sought individual duels, but those who understood how to leverage altitude, speed, survivability, and firepower as a unified whole. The machine set the terms. The pilot executed them. This shift was unsettling for those raised on older ideals. The romantic image of the lone aviator outthinking his opponent in a swirling contest of maneuvers gave way to a colder reality. Combat became procedural. Engagements followed patterns dictated by physics and performance margins rather than by personality. Victory was achieved not through daring improvisation, but through consistent application of overwhelming capability. The pilot's role narrowed, but in doing so, it became more reliable. American air power embraced this transformation without hesitation. Training emphasized system management, coordination, and repeatability. Pilots were taught to trust the aircraft and to fly it aggressively within its strengths rather than to seek personal expression through risk. The goal was not to create legends, but to produce outcomes. In this environment, individuality mattered less than consistency. The measure of success was not the story told afterward, but the mission completed and the aircraft returned. For those observing from outside this system, the contrast was stark. Where older doctrines celebrated the exceptional individual, the Corsair represented the triumph of the collective system. It embodied a philosophy in which victory was engineered into the machine long before the pilot entered the cockpit. The human element remained essential, but it was no longer sovereign. The machine had assumed the leading role. This realization carried a deep psychological sting. It implied that courage, while still necessary, was no longer decisive on its own. That experience and talent could be neutralized by disparities in design and production. That the era of the heroic individual overcoming material disadvantage had passed. In its place stood a model of warfare where the pilot was an operator highly trained, indispensable, but ultimately subordinate to the capabilities of the system he commanded. Over time, this reframing altered expectations. Pilots ceased to view combat as a proving ground for personal excellence and began to see it as an exercise in system execution. The question shifted from "Can I outfly him?" to "Can I apply the system's advantage correctly?" This change reduced variability and increased predictability, an outcome that favored the side with superior machines and industrial backing. The Corsair symbolized this transition with uncomfortable clarity. It demonstrated that modern air combat no longer revolved around equal contests between men, but around unequal contests between systems. One side relied on individual brilliance to compensate for limitations. The other removed the need for compensation entirely. In such a contest, the outcome was not dramatic, it was inevitable. The hero did not disappear. He was redefined. He became the pilot who executed doctrine flawlessly, who trusted the machine, who resisted the temptation to gamble when the system already guaranteed success. Glory yielded to efficiency. Narrative yielded to results. And in that quiet shift, the nature of air combat changed permanently. What ultimately made resistance futile was the realization that the aircraft itself was never the true weapon. The Vought F4U-4 Corsair was not an anomaly, not a singular stroke of genius that could be countered by imitation or adaptation. It was a visible expression of something far larger and far more dangerous, an industrial system capable of producing superiority as a matter of routine. This distinction mattered more than any performance figure. A machine can be studied, measured, even copied in part. A system that produces such machines reliably, repeatedly, and at scale cannot be neutralized so easily. American industrial power did not focus on creating one perfect aircraft. It focused on creating conditions where excellence could be manufactured consistently. Engines were not tuned delicately for peak performance at the cost of longevity. They were engineered to deliver power reliably across thousands of units. Airframes were not handcrafted curiosities. They were designed for repeatable production with tolerances that could be maintained across factories and shifts. Quality was not an exception, it was the baseline. This approach transformed air superiority from a temporary advantage into a sustained condition. For those analyzing from the outside, this was the most unsettling aspect. Even if one Corsair were defeated, another would replace it. Not as a downgrade, not as an interim solution, but as an identical expression of the same capability. Losses did not weaken the system, they activated it. Production absorbed attrition effortlessly, converting destruction into replacement without strategic pause. In such an environment, individual engagements lost strategic meaning. The outcome of any single fight became irrelevant compared to the certainty that the capability would persist. Attempts to frame the problem as one of copying technology missed the point entirely. Replicating an airframe without replicating the industrial context that produced it was meaningless. The Corsair depended on engines that demanded advanced metallurgy, precision machining, and quality control that could be sustained across thousands of units. It depended on supply chains capable of delivering materials at scale, on logistics networks that supported maintenance and repair, on training systems that produced pilots able to exploit the aircraft's strengths immediately. None of this could be separated from the machine itself. This was the true weapon, continuity. Where other systems struggled to maintain parity as complexity increased, American industry thrived on it. Complexity was not feared. It was managed. Redundancy was not seen as waste. It was insurance. Margin was not inefficiency. It was dominance preserved under stress. The Corsair embodied these principles not because it was unique, but because it was representative. It demonstrated what happened when engineering ambition was matched by industrial capacity. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. Facing a superior aircraft is one thing. Facing an entire system that produces superiority indefinitely is another. It removes hope from the equation. Adaptation becomes futile when the underlying disparity cannot be closed within meaningful timeframes. Even successful countermeasures offer only temporary relief, quickly overtaken by the next iteration emerging from the same production lines. In this context, the Corsair's presence signaled more than immediate danger. It signaled permanence. It suggested that whatever advantage it represented would not fade with wear, loss, or fatigue. It would be maintained, refined, and expanded as long as the system behind it continued to operate. And that system showed no signs of exhaustion. This understanding reframed the conflict entirely. Air combat was no longer a contest between aircraft types or pilot cohorts. It was a contest between industrial civilizations. One side measured strength by what it could assemble for a moment. The other measured strength by what it could sustain indefinitely. The outcome of such a contest was not decided in the sky alone, but on factory floors, in supply depots, and within organizational cultures that valued consistency over spectacle. The Corsair, therefore, did not intimidate solely through performance. It intimidated through what it implied. It was proof that the United States had solved the problem of turning technological advantage into industrial routine. That it could field machines of overwhelming capability, not as rare assets, but as standard equipment. Against such a system, resistance was not merely dangerous, it was mathematically hopeless. And once that truth was understood, the nature of fear changed. It was no longer about the next encounter. It was about the future itself. A future in which the sky would continue to be filled with machines born of the same uncompromising process, enforcing the same imbalance with no foreseeable end. Per fado, Vuescrever ***, Agra o topic 15. Weight had once been treated as a curse. For years, fighter design revolved around subtraction, remove armor, thin the structure, strip protection wherever possible to gain a few precious knots of speed or degrees of maneuverability. Lighter was assumed to be better because engines could not yet pay the price of mass without surrendering performance. This belief shaped an entire generation of aircraft and the doctrines built around them. Survival depended on avoiding being hit, because being hit meant the aircraft would not survive. The ***vought F4U-4 Corsai marked the moment when that logic collapsed. The Corsair proved that weight, when carried by sufficient power, did not have to be a liability. Excess horsepower changed the equation entirely. Armor no longer meant sluggishness. Reinforced structure no longer implied fragility elsewhere. Protection could be added without sacrificing dominance, and once that barrier fell, everything changed. The aircraft could afford to be heavy because it possessed the strength to move that weight aggressively through the sky. What had once been compromise became advantage. This transformation had immediate tactical consequences. A heavier aircraft with armor and self-sealing fuel tanks could press attacks that lighter fighters could not. It could remain exposed for fractions of a second longer, absorb return fire, and still complete the engagement. Those fractions mattered. They translated into confidence, into willingness to commit, into the ability to finish attacks rather than break them off prematurely. Weight became permission to stay, to press, to dominate. The psychological effect of this shift was unmistakable. Pilots flying lighter, unprotected aircraft learned to treat every hit as potentially fatal. Caution was not optional. It was necessary. Aggression had to be carefully rationed. By contrast, pilots in a machine that could survive damage approached combat differently. They were not reckless, but they were unburdened by the constant fear that a single round would end everything. This freedom reshaped behavior. It rewarded initiative and punished hesitation. Weight also altered endurance. Aircraft built with stronger structures tolerated repeated stress cycles without degradation. High-speed dives, violent pull-outs, and sustained combat maneuvers did not accumulate damage as quickly. Maintenance crews repaired rather than replaced. Pilots returned to fly again. Experience accumulated instead of being erased. Over time, this produced a widening gap that no tactical adjustment could close. Attempts to replicate this approach without equivalent power only exposed its dependency on industrial strength. Adding armor to lighter designs degraded performance catastrophically. Increasing engine output to compensate introduced reliability problems that strained maintenance and logistics. The lesson was clear. Weight could only become an advantage when supported by surplus power, precision manufacturing, and robust supply chains. It was not a design trick. It was an industrial statement. In this sense, the Corsair's mass was not excess, it was evidence. Evidence that American industry could afford protection, redundancy, and strength without sacrificing control of the sky. Where others were forced to choose between speed and survival, this aircraft delivered both. The old paradigm that equated lightness with superiority no longer applied. It belonged to a world constrained by scarcity rather than abundance. This realization deepened the sense of imbalance. Weight symbolized permanence. It suggested that the aircraft was built not for fleeting advantage, but for sustained dominance. It carried the physical imprint of an industry confident enough to build machines that could take punishment and continue operating. In war, that confidence translates into outcomes. By turning weight into strength, The Corsair erased one of the last justifications for lighter, more fragile designs. It demonstrated that protection did not slow victory, it enabled it. And in doing so, it closed another avenue of hope for those who believed that clever design or daring piloting could overcome industrial disparity. The sky now favored not the lightest machine, but the one that could endure longest while striking hardest. Long before formal defeat, before treaties, before acknowledgments written in ink, the war was already being lost in a quieter place. It was lost in expectation, in the gradual, reluctant recognition that confrontation no longer promised uncertainty, only consequence. This was not surrender in the theatrical sense. It was acceptance, unspoken, pragmatic, and irreversible. The appearance of the **Vought F4U-4 Corsair** accelerated that process by making the outcome of engagement predictable enough to remove hope from calculation. Psychological defeat does not announce itself dramatically. It manifests as restraint, as missions that return without contact, as intercepts aborted early under the justification of fuel, weather, or timing. These explanations are not fabrications. They are rational filters applied to an environment where the risk-reward balance has collapsed. When the cost of engagement outweighs any plausible benefit, avoidance becomes strategy rather than weakness. The critical moment arrives when this avoidance becomes consistent, when pilots no longer debate whether to engage, but whether engagement is ever justified at all. At that point, combat ceases to be a proving ground and becomes a liability. Each sortie is flown with the understanding that survival depends less on skill and more on not being seen, not being drawn upward, not being tempted into a space controlled by an opponent who holds every structural advantage. This shift corrodes morale in a way that losses alone never could. Losses can be explained, rationalized, absorbed. They can be framed as the price of resistance. But the recognition that resistance itself is futile leaves no such narrative refuge. Courage loses its meaning when it cannot influence outcome. Training feels hollow when it cannot change geometry. Even discipline offers little comfort when obedience leads only to exposure. Over time, this realization reshapes behavior at every level. Pilots internalize caution not as fear, but as professionalism. Commanders quietly adjust expectations, valuing preservation over pressure. Reports become careful, language measured, ambition restrained. No one declares defeat, yet everyone behaves as though the rules have changed. The enemy no longer needs to demonstrate superiority. It is assumed. What makes this form of defeat so complete is that it requires no decisive battle. There is no climactic moment to rally against, no single loss to avenge. Instead, there is a steady accumulation of understanding. Each avoided engagement confirms the last. Each successful disengagement reinforces the belief that disengagement is the only rational option. The war narrows from contest to containment, from initiative to endurance. In this environment, the presence of a dominant system exerts pressure even in silence. The aircraft does not need to fly overhead to be felt. Its reputation shapes choices made hours earlier, miles away. Pilots plan around it. Commanders think around it. Doctrine bends around it. The sky becomes partitioned not by lines on a map, but by mental boundaries no one wishes to cross. This is where psychological defeat becomes final. Not when aircraft are destroyed, but when they are no longer sent. Not when pilots are lost, but when pilots are preserved at the cost of initiative. The moment the mind accepts that survival and victory no longer align, the conflict has already tilted decisively. The Corsair did not need to fight every battle to win this war of perception. It only needed to make outcomes sufficiently certain that choice disappeared. When fighting becomes optional but losing does not, the decision is made in advance. And once that decision settles in the collective consciousness, no amount of exhortation can undo it. War is often remembered for its explosions and its turning points, but its most decisive moments are frequently invisible. They occur when one side realizes that the other has crossed a threshold it cannot follow, when superiority is no longer contested, only acknowledged. In that quiet acknowledgement, long before the last sortie is flown, the war is already over. Beyond its performance and its impact on tactics, the **Vought F4U-4 Corsair functioned as something more abstract and more unsettling, a signal. Not a message delivered through speeches or propaganda, but one transmitted through existence alone. It communicated what kind of society had built it, what kind of priorities guided that society, and what kind of future it was capable of sustaining. In this sense, the Corsair was not merely a weapon of war. It was a condensed expression of a civilization's organizing principles. The aircraft reflected a culture that treated engineering as a strategic language. Every design choice spoke of confidence in systems, faith in repeatability, and acceptance of complexity as a manageable challenge rather than a threat. The Corsair was not elegant in a romantic sense. It was purposeful, dense, unapologetically powerful. It carried within its structure the assumption that problems could be solved not by simplifying reality, but by mastering it through scale, coordination, and method. This stood in sharp contrast to older ideals that equated victory with exceptional individuals or inspired improvisation. The Corsair suggested something colder and more durable. It implied that success was no longer dependent on rare brilliance, but on the ability to align industry, science, training, and logistics into a single, continuous process. It showed that when a society organizes itself around producing competence at scale, heroism becomes optional and defeat becomes structural. For those observing from the outside, this was deeply unsettling. It suggested that no singular countermeasure would suffice. No inspired redesign, no tactical innovation, no surge of morale could neutralize a system that regenerated advantage as a matter of routine. The Corsair was not impressive because it existed, but because it was replaceable, because it represented a standard rather than an exception. This realization reframed the conflict as something broader than military rivalry. It became a comparison between models of organization. One model sought strength through concentration and will, assuming that mass and determination could compensate for technical gaps. The other sought strength through integration, assuming that once systems were aligned, outcomes would follow inevitably. The Corsair belonged entirely to the latter worldview. Even its imperfections reinforced this message. The aircraft was demanding to fly, complex to maintain, and unforgiving to carelessness on the ground. Yet these demands were absorbed by training pipelines, maintenance structures, and procedural discipline. Complexity did not weaken the system, it activated it. Each challenge became another proof point that the surrounding infrastructure could support and sustain advanced capability without collapse. As a civilizational signal, the Corsair communicated permanence. It suggested that what it represented would not vanish with a single program or generation. It hinted at a future in which similar machines would follow, each building on the same foundations, each reinforcing the same imbalance. The message was not, "We have built this," but "We can continue to build this." This was perhaps the most powerful psychological effect of all. It forced observers to confront not just a current disadvantage, but a trajectory they could not easily alter. The Corsair implied a momentum that extended beyond the present conflict. It signaled that the sky itself had become an industrial domain, governed by those who could organize knowledge, resources, and labor at scale. In that sense, the aircraft did not merely dominate airspace, it dominated imagination. It narrowed the range of plausible futures available to those who faced it. Once understood in this way, the Corsair ceased to be just an enemy aircraft. It became evidence that the contest was no longer about matching machines, but about matching systems of thought and production. And that was the hardest truth to accept. Not that one aircraft was superior, but that it revealed a deeper asymmetry that could not be solved in the cockpit. The Corsair flew as a warning written in aluminum and steel, announcing that modern war was no longer decided by moments of bravery, but by civilizations capable of turning intention into enduring, repeatable power. Illusions do not collapse all at once. They erode under repetition, weakened by encounters that contradict expectation until belief can no longer be defended without denial. For a time, narratives of parity survive through selective interpretation. Discrepancies are blamed on circumstance, on isolated failures, on temporary imbalance. But eventually, the accumulation of evidence overwhelms explanation. With the persistent presence of the VOT F4U-4 Corsai ***, that threshold was crossed quietly and irrevocably. What dissolved first was the illusion of catch-up, the idea that time, effort, or incremental improvement could close the gap lost credibility with every observation that revealed how wide and systemic the disparity truly was. Performance was not merely higher, it was comfortably higher. Survivability was not marginally better, it was categorically different. Production was not strained, it was routine. Each of these facts undermined the comforting belief that parity was a destination waiting to be reached. Strategic optimism gave way to constrained realism. Planners no longer asked how to win encounters, but how to avoid unfavorable ones. The language of ambition softened into the language of management. Risk replaced opportunity as the central variable. Even success was redefined, not as achieving dominance, but as minimizing exposure. This was not defeatism. It was adaptation to a reality that no longer rewarded confrontation. As illusions faded, so did the narratives that sustained morale. Appeals to ingenuity rang hollow when ingenuity could not overcome physics. Calls for resolve sounded abstract when resolve could not alter geometry. The sky had become a domain governed by margins too large to be bridged through will alone. Once this was understood, belief in symmetrical competition became untenable. This recognition did not produce dramatic reaction. There were no mass refusals, no overt declarations of inferiority. Instead, there was a subtle recalibration of expectations. Exercises emphasized caution. Engagement criteria tightened further. Success was measured in survival rather than dominance. The goal shifted from winning the air to enduring within it. Illusions of equivalence quietly exited planning rooms and briefing halls. At this stage, adaptation replaced confrontation as the only viable path. Systems were redesigned not to challenge superiority, but to operate around it. Emphasis moved toward avoidance, denial, and mitigation rather than contest. The assumption was no longer that control could be seized, but that it had to be respected. The enemy's advantage became an environmental constant, like weather or terrain, something to be navigated, not defeated. This was the final psychological transition. Once illusions fall away, clarity follows. And clarity, while painful, is stabilizing. It allows resources to be allocated realistically, doctrines to be adjusted honestly, and lives to be preserved without pretense. But it also marks the end of ambition. The moment when a force stops believing it can impose its will in the air is the moment air power ceases to be a tool of dominance and becomes a constraint. The Corsair did not destroy these illusions through spectacle. It did so through consistency, through repeated confirmation that outcomes were not anomalous, but structural. Each uneventful interception, each avoided engagement, each silent acknowledgement reinforced the same conclusion. The gap was not closing. It was enduring. In the end, what vanished was not hope in the abstract, but the specific hope that this contest could be fought on equal terms. Once that hope disappeared, the future narrowed. Choices remained, but they were bounded by acceptance rather than aspiration. The sky was no longer a place where parity might be proven. It was a place where imbalance had to be managed. And that was the true end of illusions. Not when defeat was declared, but when equality was no longer imagined. When the question ceased to be how to challenge superiority and became how to live with it. In that shift, the conflict entered its final psychological phase one, defined not by battles fought, but by battles no longer sought. Superiority does not always announce itself through confrontation. In its most advanced form, it operates quietly, shaping outcomes without demanding proof in battle. This was the final and most unsettling realization produced by the sustained presence of the **VOT F4U-4 Corsai**. The aircraft did not need to dominate every engagement to control the sky. It only needed to make resistance irrational. Once that condition was met, air superiority existed as a state, not an event. Control began to express itself through behavior rather than destruction. Patrol routes bent away from certain altitudes. Timelines shifted to avoid predictable windows. Intercepts were planned with escape as the primary objective rather than engagement. These adjustments were not ordered explicitly. They emerged organically as professionals responded to an environment where outcomes were already understood. The absence of combat was not evidence of balance, it was evidence of submission to reality. This distinction mattered deeply. Winning battles influences statistics. Controlling behavior determines strategy. When one side alters its conduct preemptively, the other has already achieved a higher level of dominance. The Corsair enforced this dominance without needing constant presence. Its reputation and the system behind it exerted pressure even in silence. The sky was no longer contested territory. It was managed space, governed by assumptions that favored only one side. What made this form of superiority so durable was its self-reinforcing nature. Each avoided engagement validated the decision to avoid. Each unchallenged patrol strengthened the belief that challenge was futile. Over time, the absence of confrontation became confirmation rather than anomaly. The system no longer required demonstration. It had become accepted fact. This acceptance reshaped strategic thinking at every level. Planners no longer considered air power as a tool for seizing advantage, but as a constraint to be respected. Operations were designed around avoidance rather than initiative. Even when opportunities appeared, they were weighed against a predictable response that nullified their value. The calculation was brutally simple. Any gain achieved through engagement would be temporary, while the cost risked permanence. In this environment, superiority ceased to be reactive. It did not depend on responding to threats. It existed independently, shaping the threat landscape before any move was made. The Corsair embodied this principle not because it was invincible, but because it made invincibility unnecessary. Control flowed from inevitability, not invulnerability. This was the endpoint of the psychological journey. Fear evolved into caution, caution into routine, routine into doctrine. What began as reaction solidified into habit. Pilots no longer thought in terms of challenge and response. They thought in terms of navigation through an airspace already claimed. The question was never how to win the sky, but how to survive within it. Such dominance leaves few visible scars. There are no dramatic wrecks to point to, no decisive engagements to memorialize. Instead, its evidence is found in absence, in the fights that never occur, the risks never taken, the ambitions quietly abandoned. This absence is not empty. It is structured, intentional, and deeply revealing. The Corsair did not need to enforce superiority every day. It needed only to establish the conditions under which superiority was assumed. Once that threshold was crossed, the sky belonged to the system that could sustain it indefinitely. Combat became optional. Control did not. In modern warfare, this is the highest form of victory. Not the destruction of the enemy's forces, but the shaping of the enemy's choices. When an opponent behaves as though defeat is already factored into every decision, the battle has been won without being fought. And when superiority persists without confrontation, it no longer depends on momentum. It becomes the default state. At that point, the war in the air is effectively over. What remains is management of an imbalance so complete that it no longer requires proof. The Corsair's true achievement was not measured in engagements won, but in engagements rendered unnecessary. Eventually, dominance stops feeling exceptional and begins to feel permanent. This was the final adjustment forced upon those who operated beneath a sky they no longer controlled. Once resistance had proven futile and confrontation had become irrational, a new phase emerged not of surrender, but of accommodation. Life continued, operations continued, but always within boundaries imposed by an unseen authority overhead. The *** Vought F4U-4 Corsair *** no longer needed to inspire fear or provoke reaction. Its influence had become ambient. Pilots and planners adapted by redefining normality. Airspace was no longer imagined as something to be contested, but as something to be navigated carefully. Missions were designed around avoidance rather than initiative. Altitudes were chosen not for advantage, but for safety. Timing was adjusted to minimize exposure rather than to maximize effect. This was not paralysis. It was survival logic refined by experience. The goal was no longer to impose will, but to function without triggering consequences. Over time, this adaptation settled into routine. New pilots were trained into an environment where inferiority was assumed from the start. They learned boundaries as facts, not failures. The idea of challenging the dominant presence overhead felt abstract, almost historical. Stories of earlier ambitions sounded distant, belonging to a different phase of the conflict. The sky, once imagined as a space of opportunity, became a managed risk zone governed by rules that could not be negotiated. This normalization had profound psychological implications. When dominance becomes environmental, it ceases to provoke anger or defiance. It is accepted like weather or terrain, something to be respected rather than confronted. The emotional energy once directed toward resistance is redirected toward optimization within constraints. Pilots measure success by returning safely, commanders by minimizing losses, planners by avoiding escalation. The language of victory quietly disappears, replaced by the language of endurance. Living under such a sky reshapes identity. Forces that once defined themselves through challenge begin to define themselves through restraint. Professionalism replaces ambition. Prudence replaces aggression. The absence of confrontation is no longer interpreted as missed opportunity, but as correct judgment. In this environment, even the desire to contest superiority fades, not because it is forbidden, but because it is pointless. What makes this state so stable is that it does not rely on constant enforcement. The dominant power does not need to patrol every hour or respond to every movement. Its control persists through expectation alone. The system beneath adapts itself automatically, anticipating consequences before they arise. This self-regulation is the clearest indicator that supremacy has been internalized. At this stage, the enemy no longer thinks in terms of winning the air. That concept belongs to the past. Instead, the focus shifts to living beneath it, conducting operations that acknowledge limitation, preserving capability where possible, and avoiding attention that would invite overwhelming response. The sky is no longer a battlefield. It is a ceiling. The Corsair's role in this transformation was indirect but decisive. It demonstrated, repeatedly and consistently, that the cost of challenge outweighed any conceivable gain. Once that lesson was learned, it no longer needed to be taught. The aircraft became part of the background, a constant reference point shaping behavior without direct interaction. This is the quietest form of defeat and the most complete. Not marked by collapse or catastrophe, but by routine compliance with an imbalance that cannot be altered. The enemy learns to live under the sky rather than within it. And when that adaptation becomes second nature, dominance has achieved its most enduring form. There comes a moment in every conflict when a shared space ceases to be shared. Not because borders are drawn or treaties signed, but because reality enforces exclusivity. The sky, once imagined as an open arena where skill and courage might always find expression, became something else entirely. It transformed into a domain governed by capability rather than aspiration. The sustained presence of the **Vought F4U-4 Corsair** marked that transition with unforgiving clarity. This was not the loss of airspace through defeat in battle, but through displacement in relevance. One side continued to operate freely, confidently, and aggressively. The other learned to operate conditionally, cautiously, and defensively. The difference was not measured in victories alone, but in freedom of action. The sky belonged to those who could enter it without asking permission from physics, industry, or probability. What made this transformation irreversible was its foundation. Superiority rooted in technology and sustained by industry does not fade with time. It compounds. Each improvement builds on the last. Each generation of pilots enters service already accustomed to advantage. Each replacement aircraft arrives not as a stopgap, but as reinforcement of an existing imbalance. In such a system, the sky is no longer contested, it is administered. The Corsair embodied this shift not because it was flawless, but because it was sufficient. Sufficiently fast, sufficiently powerful, sufficiently durable, sufficiently available. It did not require perfection to dominate. It required only that its advantages be consistent and repeatable. And once those conditions were met, resistance lost its meaning. Not its morality, not its bravery, its practicality. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of modern warfare. When one side achieves the ability to control a domain continuously, the other side's choices narrow until they resemble compliance rather than strategy. Courage remains admirable, but it no longer changes outcomes. Skill remains valuable, but it no longer defines terms. The environment itself becomes selective, rewarding only those aligned with its governing system. The sky, in this context, ceased to belong to everyone. It became selective space accessible only to those whose machines, logistics, and training could operate there without penalty. Others were not expelled, they were constrained. They could exist beneath it, around it, or at its margins, but not within it on equal terms. This distinction mattered more than any single engagement ever could. History often remembers wars through decisive battles, dramatic reversals, and heroic last stands. But the most consequential shifts are quieter. They occur when one side realizes that the conditions necessary for victory no longer exist, when adaptation replaces ambition, when survival replaces challenge, when the sky becomes something to be endured rather than claimed. The Corsair's legacy lies here, not in its kill ratios or its technical specifications, but in what it revealed about power in the industrial age. It demonstrated that sovereignty in the air is not seized through moments of brilliance, but built through systems that make brilliance unnecessary. It showed that when technology, production, and doctrine align, dominance does not need to announce itself. It simply persists. In the end, the lesson was not about one aircraft or one nation. It was about thresholds. Once crossed, they redefine what is possible and what is not. The moment the sky stops belonging to everyone is the moment war itself changes character. From that point forward, outcomes are no longer argued in the air. They are decided long before the engines ever start. And when that happens, the sky is no longer a battlefield. It is a verdict.